and that you live still is our reason for living. And so, Lord, help us to focus on that, not just today, but during the course of the week. Allow our discussion to honor and glorify you. Allow us to get from our time together that which will sharpen us and direct us during the course of our week. And allow your word, Lord, to not be void in our hearts and our minds and in our discussion during our time together today. Amen. So the typical question for the day is the one that you've heard several times, so be prepared for that. But let me start off with our focus scripture, and then let me jump to the supplementary scripture that's really been permeating much of my thinking and activity over the course of the past several weeks. So 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10, and I'm reading out of the NIV. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. And 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And in continuing to do reading, and then as we've gone through our study, and looking to supplement and have us have discussion that's valuable as well as viable. In some ways, a proving verse comes earlier in Luke, and that's in Luke chapter 6, 46. And again, still out of the NIV, want to read this to you and then pose our typical question, and then have us pose a different question that you probably won't anticipate for this week, but I want to see where it is that it takes us. And this is in the book of Luke. And Jesus is saying, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? I will show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. He is like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. So I think that those two go together very well in terms of Paul talking about what that looks like, what that even maybe feels like when it is that you hear Jesus's words and then you're putting them into action and into activity. Paul's describing it that there's persecution, there's hardships, there's insults, and he doesn't necessarily say that there's a constant relying on Jesus, but the context is there that suggests that this thorn in his flesh is so adamant and is so persistent that he wants out of this. But the Lord says no, and then he recognizes I'm stronger because Jesus gets to be illuminated through me when I am not at my best, when I'm not at my strongest, when I'm not at my best sense of ownership. So keep that in mind as we go through the discussion today. It will definitely lend itself to the first question, which you've heard before. The second question, again, may be a little bit of a curve, but it should take us maybe to some interesting positions. So do folks have Jesus encounters that they want to share with us this week? All right. So what you're thinking about this question being posed on a regular basis, what you're thinking when you hear what it is that Diane just shared, when you are in the company of some of the commentary that Ellen just shared. How does that impact you?
I think the same thing that Ellen has voiced when she reads the reports from Ed and Anita and Bob and Judy. I'm not doing enough. course, I basically spent last week, apart from a little bit of yard work, feeling a lot like the Maytag repairman. But yard work took me to the dump, and I engaged in conversation, but didn't take it to Jesus. And it seemed like there was somebody else that I talked to again and my wanderings, but very much like what Preston said last week, I'm thinking about the mission that I'm on, and at the same time, I'm thinking about the mission they are probably on as well, and or the folks around us, and not wanting to delay other people, like unloading at the dump kind of thing. I did try to help the fella next to me who talked to me a little bit, but yeah, it's I'm my initial response is I need to get busier.
Hey, I appreciate that, Gene, especially because that has kind of a dual meaning. I need to get busy, or I need to get busier. Well, I need to get busier perhaps with the topic that we're discussing right now. But the funny thing about it is typically we're en route or we're in the middle of doing something, and that's the busy that we want to focus on.
Yeah, I think you said it last week.
Thank you for listening. And because you're approaching things the way that you are, Gene, with your open-mindedness, then the question that I pose will not be such a curve to you, because in some ways the precipitant or a precipitant is the information or the most recent communications we've gotten from both Bob and Judy and from Ed and Anita. And I hope you read those. And it's really nice to comment, oh, what a wonderful job they're doing. That's terrific. But folks, in some regards, some of the sharing that we're doing right now, and I hope this makes a kind of sense to you. There's an encouragement or a desire to help shape. You're talking about Jesus. You're talking about Jesus, right? And his reality and import in your life right now and every day. And then on top of that, it's also looking to help shape something that is a foreign word for a lot of us, and in some ways, if not a foreign word, a scary word and concept: testimony. This is the kind of thing that's missing from people when they congregate regularly, because they're focused on the business of church as opposed to the significance and impact of Jesus's church. And so instead of us rehashing a 30 or 40 year or 10-year-old resume item about our encounter and our admission of Jesus, we're looking to have you folks discuss how Jesus is real every week in your life. And that is a truer testimony than the fact that you made a profession of faith or said some sort of interesting prayer 30, 40 years ago. Does that make sense? And so I don't know that everybody's in agreement, but maybe this next question will help to flesh this out. But I do want you to think, if you've read the latest report from Ed and Anita, and Bruce and Gene have heard me overly say, and sometimes you guys have heard it, tongue in cheek, I applaud mightily what they do, but I also want to put on gloves and hit Ed as hard as I possibly could, because his reports about impacting the world for the kingdom of Jesus are just exciting, and they are consistent, and they are nonstop. And in some regard, and I know brother Bruce has this. I know brother Jerry has this from certain perspectives. As a competitive person, man, it just makes you go, I'm standing in place. I'm basically running in place. If I'm running, I'm probably walking in place. I may even be standing in place when I'm reading those kind of reports. But also on the heels of that, there's been some interesting news this week about some sermons that have been presented and folks looking to pull those back, et cetera. And that got me thinking about this next question that I'm going to ask you. And it'll be interesting to, I'm hoping that you'll play along as the question is posed. But I'm also believing that many of you have had this experience before, and there's a point to us having the discussion. So let me ask the question, present it, and then ask for your response. So this is not a rhetorical question. This is really looking for your response. Let me see if I've got it here. So, what's your experience when a church member, and this is assuming that all of you have not, if you've not been in church, you are a member or you've been a member of a church, but what's your experience when a church member announces to the congregation that he, she, or they are being called to the ministry? So does that sound like a foreign encounter to present to you, or is that something with which you've had some familiarity?
Yeah,
Would
we
you,
had it because I'm looking at my guy in the middle here on my screen because Bruce was called to Hawaii, right?
Okay, okay,
And and I can tell that he was based on what happened in Hawaii and what is happening, right? But sometimes when people leave, they kind of use that as an excuse. Why are you laughing at me?
I
Um,
appreciate I appreciate the road you're going down. Thank you.
because you can only take it at face value, right? You can't really, well, 9 times out of 10, we don't know for sure if that's really what happened or not. We can see it how it's manifested in one of the folks who hangs out with us. But other folks, when they leave because they've gotten called away, you never really hear anything anymore. So you don't really know if that's really what happened or if they were just abandoning ship. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So, you want to believe that's really what happened. So you have to kind of take it at face value. But sometimes, or you hear things later and you're like, really? Okay. And then you start to just really, next person leaves, you're like, yeah, whatever. They're not really been called away. They just want to leave us.
would you
We
restate your
certainly.
question, Preston?
I sure will. Sure. What is your experience when a church member announces to the congregation that he, she, or they are being called into the ministry?
Okay, that I heard that completely differently. Because I wasn't associating it with the departure of people. By the time Bruce left, he had already acknowledged and followed a call to the ministry. So that's, to me, that's different. And you make me think about, and I hate to do this because of all of what you just said about years ago, you make me remember my acknowledgement to the call to the ministry. I went to my then pastor, Tom Parlett, and told him I felt like I was called to the ministry. And then he asked me, well, why are you crying? And I go, well, I don't think I'm up to it. I don't, there may have been even a fear factor involved there as well. So that's from the other side of that. Uh, I recognized the call to the ministry at that point. It wasn't until I was at Faith and Steve Lilly was the pastor that I actually went forward and actually surrendered to that call. So there's a two-step process: recognition of the call, surrendering to the call, and that happened as well. And the next thing I know, I've got a job and a place to live in Lynchburg to follow that call. So when somebody else says, I believe I've been called to the ministry, I'm reminded of something I heard at Liberty. Um, Woody Kroll said, stay out of the ministry if you can help it. And his whole thrust there was, if you can stay out of the ministry, then you're not called. If you can't stay out of the ministry, you're supposed to be there. And so when somebody says that they're called to the ministry, that's my first thought. Stay out if you can, because if you're not called, it is not for you.
Okay. Other folks, your experience with this announcement to the congregation?
Well, I was going to say, I think we drove by that church just a little while ago down here at the beach. There was, I guess they were the youth pastor was, and they were being called somewhere else, but they didn't know where, which was kind of weird. It's like, how are you being called somewhere else, but, you're waiting to figure out the where. That kind of gave us a chuckle. And I guess my other thing would be, how are you defining the ministry? Are we talking about being called to be a full-time pastor somewhere? Because aren't we all called to be, witnesses and doing some kind of ministry, every one of us, if we're a Jesus believer? So, I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up in the Catholic Church. So all that stuff is kind of foreign to me.
Well, I'd like to respond to both of those. Number one, I personally believe, now this is me, I personally believe, just like Philip was called away from the Ethiopian to something else, and he was even called away from Samaria to the Ethiopian, God calls you to something, not away from something. That's just my own personal opinion. Secondly, when we are all called, but I understood the question to be called to full-time service, called to study for the ministry, called to prepare for a more in-depth ministry. That's the way I understood that. I think of Trent, and my sense again was that's exciting, but stay out of the ministry if you can help it.
My thought has always been when I've heard somebody say they're being called was, okay, what's the plan? What, when I hear them say they're being called to the ministry and they've never done anything like this before is, okay, you're being called to prepare for the ministry. And then once you're prepared, where is God calling you to? We saw all that evident with Bruce. He said he was called to the ministry. He went and prepared. Then God called him to our church, and then God called him away. I never had any problem with that. I've had other ministers say, well, God's calling me somewhere else. Where's he calling you to? And they don't know yet. But the thought is, if you're called to the ministry, you need to be prepared. It's not one of those situations where, he's calling you to the ministry and you're supposed to step into that pulpit tomorrow or whatever else on the mission field or whatever else it is. We have a kind of a joke in our industry is, with engineers and everything, yesterday I couldn't spell it. Today I are one. It doesn't work like that.
I think there's another way we have a tendency in our 21st century to view it exactly as Jerry just voiced. At the same time, I think we also need to acknowledge that God can do something, and the preparation may have already taken place, and somebody's supposed to do a stepping out and make use of the preparation that they've already had. We just don't know that they've had it. And again, can be something miraculous. Again, I think of Paul. Paul was prepared a long time before the road to Damascus, thanks to his walking with Gamaliel. But it wasn't until he spent the time on the backside of the desert that he began to see how it all dovetailed together. And he was able to realize, oh, Jesus is Messiah. I need to do something different. And we're going to talk about Paul today anyway. But we have a tendency to put the emphasis on the preparation these days, and I get that, I understand that, done that, but let's not discount the fact that God can call and he can equip very, very suddenly and very, very miraculously.
Other folks?
This may be a little, sorry, a little different take, but sometimes maybe it's because we tend to, when we talk about ministry, we tend to put those people up on the pedestal in our heads. So when someone we know, we've been around, comes out and says that they've been called to the ministry, sometimes your initial reaction is, really? Because maybe you haven't seen that evidence so far in their lives, and you're expecting something so I don't know, so spiritual, that it kind of all puts you, it's putting them into that position, and that's on us because sometimes that's how we think. But I think sometimes it is how we perceive what the ministry should be, and whether it's as a pastor, or as a teacher, or is it the type of ministry that we all should be as we go doing. So that's just kind of my take on it.
Wow. Other thoughts?
Other than Bruce, I've never had someone call to ministry to something that I can think of. But I was thinking about my own case when I was at the Methodist church and felt called out by God that this was not the right place for me anymore. I didn't know where I was going. And it was a time between when I left and when I found you guys, and that Sunday that I was there and wept pretty much through the whole service, that it was a time of, I guess, growth, because I was clinging more to him to say, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? But I didn't feel like I was called to a ministry as much as I was waiting on the Lord to tell me where he wanted me to be.
Yeah, I think your situation, the one you just described, is a different one than the question. However, there's import when, as we continue to discuss, that situation as well. Because I do think, what you described is not someone being called into the ministry, it's someone being told, you need to leave. And I think that that's a different scenario than this one that presents itself often in Protestant churches. So keep that in mind, because I think we'll come back and we'll address that, I think, as we go. Yes, sir.
Let me just interject one other comment. One of the things we experienced at Liberty, I say we like someone else was here, and was that so-and-so has been called to the ministry by the mama. There have been people like that as well. We would encounter them at school. God has had nothing to do with it. It was just, you need to be a preacher from mom or dad or someone like that. And so there may have been some sort of spiritual influence there, but there are some folks called to the ministry that the Holy Spirit has nothing to do with it. It is all about some family member that says, you need to go to Liberty so that you can be a minister.
Other experiences, other instances, other perspectives that you want to share when you've heard that particular announcement in your congregations? All right. So we've heard from a few folks. Maybe your thinking juices will get stimulated as we go through and talk a little bit. So I've had this experience a few times in Virginia during our time in Virginia, but this was a regular circumstance in my church growing up. This would happen pretty regularly, and someone would announce that the Lord was calling them into the ministry, and then there'd be certain machinations, certain procedures that would happen, and then almost like Jerry's contribution earlier, very shortly that person would be in the pulpit, and they would be preaching or presenting, and that was called at that time. Well, still called that now. It was called their trial sermon. And on the basis of the trial sermon, typically the head dude, the head pastor, would be able to endorse, yes, the calling is valid. Yes, it's good, and we'll plug them in some regard. So that's probably a very different background than maybe some of you that are congregating this morning with us have experienced before. But I can tell you, not only did it happen, it continues to happen today in that regard. There's a lot of interesting flavor to some of your experiences and some of what you shared. So let me throw out some thoughts and have you maybe respond to some of these. And when I've experienced it mostly in Virginia, some of my thinking has been stimulated with some of the following thoughts. Typically, that person or that family is departing or they're furloughing from the congregation for some period of time. Now, that doesn't always happen, but it does. Has happened in our experience. They're usually endeavoring to enroll in and attend seminary. And then following seminary, they're usually looking to get placement from a church, a diocese, or a missionary board as to where it is that they're going to be serving. So in throwing that out, is that some of your experiences when you've heard people that say that they are called to the ministry? Okay, thank you there, Brother Jeans, Brother Bruce, thank you. Okay, thank you, Jerry. And I would say that that's usually the flavor in Southern Baptist Church. What I just described is typically what happens in the Southern Baptist Church. Make sense? Okay.
During our discussion, though, I'm going to have to jump in here because somebody else came to mind. And I don't know their preparation background, but it would be hard to dispute that Tony McDonald was called to the ministry because I don't know whether he has gone to be prepared, but he knows the Bible. He preaches beautifully. He's empowered by the Spirit. Again, let's not discount God's working. What you've just described is indeed what it typically does happen in the 20th, 21st century, but God does other things as well.
Yeah, agreed. And that God does other things is available for us to see in the book of Acts, if not the four Gospels, right? And so I will respond to your interjection there, Brother Dean, by saying the leadership there at that particular church, indeed, they've not attended seminary. So the calling is one that is very different, has a different orientation in regard to the Holy Spirit, and then the evidence of that calling. Not so much sheepskin, it's evidential in the presentation and then the life. Okay, so my question posed, and maybe this is an awful question to ask, but let me throw this out there. So when these folks come to the front of the church, because that's typically what happens, the pastor or the senior elder presents them and says, these folks are called to the ministry. They give some sort of a statement. My question following that up is this one. How come the leadership of that church doesn't equip these called ones in-house for the ministry to which they're called. Did
We
that make
never
sense?
did it that way before.
Did everybody understand the question?
Yes. And you know what? That is such a valid question. This is one of the things that has impressed me about Ed Hoagland. Rather than saying, okay, let's send them off to Liberty or ORU or somebody else, we'll train them. And we've got our own Bible college kind of thing. And so that's huge because literally we don't do it that way. And maybe we should. That's an excellent question.
I think there's a perception based on my exposure to pastors over the last number of years. There's a perception among pastors that they're super busy.
Yes, sir.
And so they can't add one more thing to their plate. I think in some cases they are, because I think some churches do require more from pastors than is in the Bible.
Yes, sir.
And I refer to that as the chaplaincy model of pastoring, which is not in Scripture. But yeah, I think there's that. I think there's a case too where they may not feel adequate, like they can provide. I mean, when you ask the question, my immediate thought, being from Williamsburg, is that, you know, I think of George Wythe training Thomas Jefferson in the law in his house, as opposed to, of course, there weren't any law schools then in the New World, really. I guess Harvard maybe, but I think that's one of them. I will say this: when I had that initial call, Pastor Don did point me in some directions, and I felt more like he threw me into a few fires. But nonetheless, I think he was testing my, almost like testing my call to see if it was real, because I think he felt that if I folded, then I was probably not serious. So I could get into that, but I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I think it comes down to the fact that I think a lot of pastors, I don't know. I guess maybe they just feel like that's your call, and it's not my. I've not been called to teach you. You've been called. I've not been called to teach you. Discipleship is maybe not, I mean, that would be discipleship, but that's not the level that they've bought into.
So Bruce brings up a really interesting point, and part of the reason that it's fun to have these exchanges is because when you share and when you interject in the way that you do, typically the talking point that I have is one that you bring up, and then I don't get to be the only bad guy. You get to share in being the bad guy along with the facilitator. And I like that Bruce says that the perception of many church senior pastors or the if he's the hierarchical only pastor of the church is that he's too busy. And that's because and I didn't say this, Brother Bruce said it, although I would endorse what Brother Bruce said, is that's less the Bible model of what a presbyter, of what an elder is supposed to be, and it's more the cultural concept of what it is that your pastor is supposed to be. Because when I read the scripture, the pastor, the elders, if you've got to call it those fancy names, they're in charge of four things: teaching, praying, equipping, and preaching. Those are the four things they're in charge of. In terms of the business of the church, if you want to elect a board or a bunch of superintendents or deacons, they run the business of the church. In terms of the ministry of the church, that's the four things that the leaders are supposed to be in charge of. And so when you distill it down that way, then it would appear not only do they have time if those are their responsibilities, but that's what they should especially make time for. When someone of the group feels called out among the called out ones, that person deserves special attention from the leadership because they're ready to then begin to function in those four: preaching, teaching, equipping, and praying. They're ready for those leadership skills in terms of honoring and worshiping Jesus. So I just said a whole bunch there that may feel like a slap in the face, because that would suggest then that your pastor going to the church to visit you when you're sick, supervising your weddings, supervising your funerals, not telling you that those are bad things, but I'm telling you that those are not necessarily Bible responsibilities. So continuing the conversation, your thoughts there.
And he gave some apostles and some prophets and some as evangelists and some as pastors and teachers for the visitation in the hospital and the visitation of for the equipping of the saints for the work of service to the building up of the body of Christ until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. So, I'm just dumb enough to believe that if we've been called to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, our job is equipping the saints for service, for the building up of the church until all this other stuff takes place. So we've got a description, we've got an assignment, we've got the term of the assignment. I'm not sure what else we need. And yeah, I appreciate Bruce's, pointing out that we have a lot of stuff. I mean, weddings and funerals and hospital visitation and visiting folks that are the bereaved. I think that there's a place for that, but there's an equipping that we're supposed to be doing. And I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't get discipled until I landed in Lynchburg. To be real honest. There was a little bit in the youth group. Not a lot. There was, I do recall a time when I went with Don on hospital visitation and he gave me some pointers there. Pointers that at this stage of the game are unneeded because they're required when you go into the hospital anyway. That's about it. We have a Bible directive that tells us what we're supposed to be doing. And why do we call him Lord, Lord, and not do what he says?
Other thoughts about that? By the way, Gene just reiterated all of that stuff. I didn't pay him to say that.
It sounds like to me that we've watered down what each gift means. The expectations of the pastor, we've added on all this stuff that they should not be in charge of, whether they have agreed to take it on. Because in some ways, don't we all hide from what we're called to do in any way that we can? Think about all the traditions in the church that aren't necessary. They take away from what we should be doing while we're there. I just look at it as maybe we should get, as they say, back to basics. Where do you get, we don't understand the gifts and what each one does. So we add all this other stuff in because it's almost like hiding from what our mission is.
I'm going to say this, hoping that Garrison is nowhere in earshot. But I remember a VeggieTales episode where the song was about, okay, I think I said it, and there's nothing flying toward the screen, so I think we're safe. Um, the song was about being busy, busy, terribly busy. And it's really easy for us to point at and talk about the world and not see the busyness of the church. We're busy, and we're busy doing things that don't necessarily build the kingdom. We're busy doing things that build culture, that build community, but ultimately are wood, hay, and stubble. And I know that may be difficult for us to hear. And please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that visiting our sick, that services for our deceased, that nuptials, that christenings. I'm not telling you those things aren't important. What I'm saying is, when I read the Bible, there are at least a couple of places where I see that those may have been the needs of the community. One is back in the Sinai Peninsula in the desert, when Moses was leading millions potentially through the desert. And the other one was when the church was growing by thousands every day, and the 12 are being called upon to go hither and there. And in both situations, the response was assign faithful men to be able to go and provide those ministries, because the teaching, praying, equipping, preaching for the people is that which is the role of those folks in those particular situations. Yes, sir.
So, and I'm doing this tongue in cheek, okay? Just,
Sure.
are you saying that the pyramid schemes have been around that long?
I am, except there seems to be only one tier beneath that tier, because part of our discussion today is when we get to that second tier, typically the third tier would be church members, and church members don't operate as though ultimately they want to move up in the pyramidal structure. They're content to be on the last rung.
Because they're busy checking boxes and doing their own thing?
Because the top tier has limited the impact of the congregation.
That's where the issue is. That's where the issue is. When you first asked the question about people called to the ministry, I was just reminded of this weird hierarchical pecking order that we have of holiness. And we don't see setting up chairs or cleaning toilets or policing the parking lot. And I'm talking real basic stuff, much less telling your neighbors about Jesus as really being ministry, being kingdom work. We just don't see that. I think we do a really good job. I include myself in this. We include a really good job in making people satisfied with attending a church service, maybe doing some sort of a ministry thing, but not stirring within them a hunger and a thirst for something more. I'm preaching on the fruit of the Spirit today, and it really has kind of rattled my cage some this week, because I've come to realize that the fruit of the Spirit really is talking about our interpersonal relationships with other people. If you look at it, starting in the middle of that chapter and going forward, it really is talking about how we interact with the world and other believers. It's not some holy, high-minded thing. And one of the words in there is the word faithful. And it's the same word that's used in 2 Timothy 2:2. We're supposed to commit teaching to faithful people who can teach other people. That's the idea. And I really don't think that the modern church teaches people how to be, because the word could also be, here you go, loyal and trustworthy. We do not teach people how to be loyal. The people on this call have shown it in your persistence that you are loyal to the cause of Christ. But where's everybody else? Where's everybody else? Right? I mean, you guys have invested in people, and they come for a season and then they just, and I see that all the time. People are faithful only to the level that they want to be. And unfortunately, in the Christian church of the 21st century, they don't want to be. My faithfulness goes as far as maybe pitching a buck or two in the plate and showing up for a church service. But if you ask me beyond that, and so, and to a certain extent, I can't blame them. I feel like we've not asked them
Right.
to be faithful followers of Christ and to be a priesthood of believers. We've not done it. We've not set the bar higher, and be okay. And I'm right here. I'm speaking right where I am right now in ministry. To be okay if when you present the truth of the scripture, to have them walk away.
Yep.
like Jesus did in John 6. But if you really teach them the truth, maybe a lot more would stick. But if we just kind of soft pedal it in, then instead of them walking away angry because they're not willing to do it, let them float away later when they get bored. I don't know. My thoughts.
I was
Well,
going to say that, yeah, I was going to say that those folks that come for a season and then they just get called away. It seems. And I'm not trying to say anything disparagingly regarding Diane's sense, because she left because she realized that, as I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she left because she realized that this was not a biblical, this was not a Christ-centered world, and we're supposed to walk away from that. Okay, I get that, but if and she brought with her Kim, and I'm not sure how they're doing, but anyway, I did not recall your crying through the entire service, but maybe I was not paying attention. But we do have some folks that we're not their cup of tea, so they get called elsewhere. And I'm not sure how that all works out. I think we're really working towards, if they're not there, being as biblical as possible in the 21st century. But maybe we've got some work to do, or maybe we need to care more. Maybe we need to, I know I need to care more. I need to give a flip. So, but that's just me.
Throughout our history, our church history, our slides started when we started asking people, do something. I remember one summer, Bruce, if the grass didn't get cut, it was because me or you weren't in town to do it. The whole summer, we couldn't beg people to. I mean, we had the equipment. It was just, hey, come out and put a little sweat in, and you ain't got to talk to anybody or anything. Just a little work, and nothing but crickets during that time. But we've historically, when we gotten to the point where we said, hey, this is more about than just sitting here on a pew listening to somebody. Do something with what you're hearing. And we've seen them, oh, no, I don't think I can do that. We'll find something somewhere else where I can go hide some more.
That's huge, Jerry. I recall a time when, and to be real honest, he's gotten beat up so much. There were sometimes he did his very best to try to do things right. Don Crane instituted a thing where the very thing you're talking about, membership meant service. He attempted to do that. And again, there was this falling away, calling away kind of thing that happened because folks did not want to sign up for that. They'd rather go, and I think this is an expression he used. They'd rather sit, soak, and sour.
So, folks, you're beginning to hit on some of the themes that are driving what we're doing together, why we're congregating, to be able to understand that there should be less a division between the clergy and the laity than our modern churches have, not only allowed and permitted, but indeed endorse. And let me throw a couple of thoughts out for you so you can see this. Bruce used the term, so let me add it. This hierarchical thinking that we have that's ingrained even in the Protestant churches. Because I'll tell you, this is already empirically a structure of the other religions that exist. So what I'm going to talk about, well, I'm not even going to talk about, but I'll mention it. In Catholicism, there is a hierarchy. With the Latter-day Saints, there is a hierarchy. Even though they don't sort of say it, and with the Jehovah Witnesses, there is a hierarchy. So with many of the other religions, there's a place where kind of you start, and then there's a place that you aspire to be, and that place where you aspire to be is a place that you have no right to occupy when you're a rookie. And one of the things that I see in my scripture, and one of the things that you've heard me say that I've learned in a hard way, but a wonderfully exciting and stark way, when we had Brother Steve's brother, who's a pastor, come to our church. He talked about, and this is all through the Bible if you can see it, but you have to think about it differently, and more differently than a Western going church congregationalist. Steve's brother talked about going and on mission trips, spreading the gospel, having people seem to be very ardent and faithful believers in a short period of time, and then Steve's brother would leave and turn the church over to that guy. So when I first heard that, I'm going, that just makes no sense at all. That's crazy. That guy just became a believer 2 weeks ago. Well, it's crazy thinking if, number one, I don't believe in the power of the Holy Spirit to be able to transform people in an instantaneous fashion. And number two, it's a very possessive way of thinking, because that's not how the church operates in the United States, certainly. And so having rookies manage the team doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense until I look at the scriptures. And so the foolishness of God's thinking, the foolishness, because that's how I look at it, is the sensibility of how his kingdom operates. Because I can't get my head around that. And so my thought to you, or some thoughts to you, is I know in conversations when people have made that announcement and they go to the front of the church, and it's because it's kind of a big deal. It's a big deal when you go to the front of the church and your family comes up to join you, and the ministers come down, and there's this announcement made over the microphone, and a whole bunch of people come, they lay their hands on you. So my question was not about necessarily the participants, of which in some ways Gene and Bruce are. It was the folks who are the observers. What's your perspective on that? And so let me throw out a couple for you, because I know in watching this over the years, some of my thoughts were this. Oh, they're special people. Thank you guys for that look. Wow. They're better than me. But then the other thinking sometimes is this one too. Better them than me. So when we've been in the congregations when these special announcements happen, by the way, I hope that sense that I just that scenario I painted for you is one that you've seen, because that's usually how it's happened in Virginia when somebody makes this pronouncement. It's a big deal. Now, sometimes it goes nowhere. I've actually seen it where the person kind of comes and makes that pronouncement, and all the special bells and whistles happen, and Happy Days Are Here Again's played through the loudspeaker if that needs to happen. And then because the person is not necessarily one of the beautiful people of the church, that ministry announcement goes nowhere. Thank you, Brother Bruce. Thank you for that. So my question in that event is, so what are the rest of us doing while these folks are being called to the ministry? What are the rest of us doing?
Oh, I think we're probably doing some of the same thing you just mentioned. Better than me. I ain't gonna do that. Um, maybe we're even scoffing and going, well, they were in the slammer last week. They'll probably be in the slammer again next week, you know. So that we've got a scoffing that's going on. We've got a, yeah, right. You know, so I think it runs the gamut. We're gonna do a lot of different things, but I think your question is more, what are we doing with regard to ministry while these other special recognitions are taking place? And I think that's probably the better question. Like, I think it was Ellen that said it, aren't we all called to do something as opposed to all of a sudden have this special recognition or special clothing or special uh training or blah blah blah. And I appreciate your reference to Mark because that's really very, very first century. Because I mean, he got saved 2 weeks ago, but everybody else got saved a week ago. He is the senior elder. You know, if you've had a week more experience in that kind of culture, you're the top dog because you've got some capability and there's an understanding there. And one of the other things that happens that I don't think we get is, oh, I've got a responsibility.
Ooh.
Maybe I had better do something about that and get ready to do something. This whole description you did of a trial sermon, a test sermon. Um, I don't know that that's a terrible thing. We have ordination councils, and I've sat on a few of those, where we're examining the candidate kind of thing to determine whether or not they're supposed to be ordained. That's not a bad thing, but I think of Stephen in the Bible. You know, uh, there was a call put out. We need to have some folks to serve. Stephen was examined for faithfulness, for literally serving tables, for feeding the widows. And we don't look at, we don't do that in our churches. If you want to teach Sunday school, all you got to have is a pulse, typically. But we don't care to examine the ones that are going to be teaching children or adults to find out whether or not they have any sort of understanding of the Word of God. And again, I think of the peace tree. They could get some erroneous teaching if we don't do a better job of putting people in leadership. So yeah, we're doing a lot of different things in response to that, I think.
I'm going to come at you from 180 degrees. I think lots of times, and Preston, I know you were involved with a body for a while where pretty regularly couples would be trotted up to celebrate the fact that they were going off on a 2-year mission abroad somewhere. And they were kind of sometimes very humble families, but sometimes they were kind of not, kind of bright and shiny couples who were just going to go off and, do our thing in wherever, some other far-flung part of the world. While that was all going on and all the lights were flashing and the people were hooting and hollering, the reality was back in other parts of the church, people were just serving. They were taking care of kids. They were doing helps ministries. They were doing all the things that the Bible tells us to do. And they would continue to do that the week and the month and the year and the decade after those people had gone off and made their big splash. And, I think of how 1 Corinthians 12 talks about the less honorable members. They just, quote unquote, they just got it done. So while all the all the vaunted stuff was happening, they just got their thing done. And by the way, lots of times they'd come in and they'd celebrate the fact that those people are going off to do that because they were kingdom-minded people and they were hoping for the best for them. But, just to kind of give it from that perspective as well. While we're all caught up in our important things, quote unquote, a lot of stuff's getting done that nobody ever seems to really recognize.
Diane mentioned earlier that her daughter struggles a little bit, if not a lot, with the hypocrisy that is humankind that unfortunately permeates the church, right? And my odd suggestion is something based on a comment that Pastor Bruce made earlier. And he didn't make this one earlier today, but the theme is kind of in some of the things that he's saying. Church people work hard to court folks to come and participate and be a part of the church. And I'm not telling you that that's not important, because I know, Diane's got a heart for the community in a way that very, very much supersedes my own by several factors of hundreds. But if we're presenting the gospel, and if we're doing the work, and if we're also requesting that folks grab a part of the parachute so that we can all hold it together, and that doesn't seem to be something that they want to do, we need to chase it a little bit, and then we need to be okay letting it go. And here's why I say that. If we can do that, and then we're committing our rank and file member, doesn't have to be a brother Gene who's called to preach, a brother Bruce who's not only called to preach but the pastor, but if we can have our rank and file all holding a part of the parachute and recognizing that they're important to doing that, then our church gets to be a little bit more human. Our congregation begins to be a little bit more human, and folks understanding that we're not on pedestals. We are the folks right next to you who have zits and an awful breath and Charlie horses, and sometimes you need to hear me complain a little bit, because I'm not a special person. I'm not specialer than you. I'm not better than you. I'm right next to you doing the work that you do, and in the same way that you fail, in the same way that you stumble and struggle, I do too. As opposed to sometimes our churches being full of bright and shiny people who were just waiting to watch from afar them fall off their mantle so we can go, there it is. So let me pause there for a bit. Thoughts? That makes sense? Your leadership right now in terms of preaching, teaching, praying, and equipping are participants on this phone. I'm sorry, on this virtual gathering this morning. But we're not specialer than the rest of us. And we're asking all of us to grab a part. And you guys, when I'm talking about the parachute, you guys ever go to Parks and Rec when you were a kid, and you'd have the parachute and you play a couple of different games with it? Everybody would hold it and you'd throw it up and people would run underneath, or they'd switch places. And if you had a strong enough parachute and strong enough participants, you could actually put someone in the middle of the parachute and flip them up, because you had more strength together than you did as one person attempting to do that. So if you've not seen people use a parachute for other than jumping out of a plane, I'm sorry that my example may not be working for you. This is one I remember watching a bunch of kids being able to effectively hoist another kid or two up, because we were all holding the parachute while we're using it recreationally. So this is not this is not the way you skydive. So please don't use that as a how-to skydive. This would not be a YouTube or a TikTok video for that. This would be the opposite of that. But it makes sense that a Jesse would say to mom, you people are hypocrites, in part because we sit and we point fingers at the special people once they do something stupid or drop the ball. And this is a comment I made a few weeks back, that Christianity used to be where the weird and unique people would flock to after the 60s kind of subsided. So all of those weirdos and nuts and hippies from the 60s, when they were still weird and unique, they would flock to Christianity. Well, Christianity has been so unwelcoming that now it's very easy to flock to the alphabet crew. Because if you want to be celebrated, you just admit that your ring finger hurts a whole lot and they've got a letter for you, and they'll celebrate that. You'll get your own special day and some sort of parade, and that's where you can go and hang out. And so there are, so Christianity is not a special place anymore. It's almost like an exclusive club. Now, here's the thing. It is an exclusive club because of how the membership works. There's only one way to gain membership, but everybody's welcome. And we do a really bad job of, once everybody's welcome, then giving people the responsibility, like the old American Express commercial. Membership has its privileges, but it also has its responsibilities. So let me pause there for a second.
I think there's two reasons why. Just from kind of my perspective personally as a pastor, I think the reason we don't plug people in well in doing ministry is number one, sometimes there's somebody already in the way that you probably need to move out, that you probably need to progress. They've not that they've not done a good job, any of that kind of thing, but I think sometimes people kind of take residence in ministry. And they're comfortable and they like it, ... And probably they need to progress, but they kind of own it. I'll just say it that way. And so it's kind of hard to get them out of the way, and they don't really want somebody else to be in their patch. So there's that. I think number one, and kind of related to that, and I just experienced this 2 days ago. I got a couple that have been coming to the body for a while, coming to the service, and they've become a part of our group. And I've gotten a chance to hang with them and see what kind of legs they've got. And they need to be leading worship. They just need to be doing it, right? And so I talked to the husband the other night, and I'll have to share some of this with you offline, Preston, because it kind of challenged some of my sensibilities about some of their ideas about rehearsal and things like that. But the bottom line is, I believe they're called to do it. I believe they're equipped to do it. They're not going to do it the way that I do it, but they should be doing it. And so I was just like, you know what? I was going at it, and we're having this conversation, and I'm kind of like banging up on what he's talking about, and I'm struggling with it. And it was just like the Lord said, it was like, oh, he almost spoke to me, and it was like, just get out of the way. And so I said, all right. And so I told him, I said, I've already got money. I got this Sunday lined up. I said, next Sunday, it's yours. And it was like, okay, if it's a disaster, we'll deal with it. But the reality is, so oftentimes people aren't going to do it the way that I'm going to do it. They're not going to do it the way that you're going to do it. But somehow I've come to think that, well, my way is the Bible way. And so I think we hold people back because they don't do it the way that we do it. And what's an amazing thing is, lots of times when we get out of the way, we let people do it because the Lord's pointed them that way. They end up doing it better than we did.
Yeah.
And you know, I think about some of the people I've watched over the years. I think about the passion that they get into it with. I think when Sarah and Steve started doing children's ministry years ago, and just there was a joy, and the Lord empowered that in such an amazing way. And I could repeat that across a lot of the folks on this call. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is that it's like, well, yeah, I want you to serve, but I want you to serve my way, as opposed to just, if you've been empowered by the Lord, if you've been taught and shown how to do it, go. And the Lord will bless that.
That reminds me of an expression that I think you coined, Bruce. When it comes to ministry, you need to let your thoroughbreds run. They've got an equipping, they've got a power, they've got a means by which to get it done. It may not match yours, but you need to let them run.
Definitely
How
came from my
often-
mouth, but that's not an original thing, but thank you for that.
I want to say, how often do we not let people do things because we perceive their lifestyle may not be what we think it should be? Whereas people that may be serving have things hidden in their past that we can't see. You know, how often do we turn people away and off because of our own judgmental behavior?
So I think that's certainly a valuable contribution and a thinking guy. Our mindset may need to look a little like Paul's, because Paul actually Jesus actually comments about this briefly, and Paul actually shows you how it plays out. Jesus, and I'm paraphrasing, Jesus comments on this when the disciples want to blow up a guy who's exorcising demons. And I like the disciples because regularly they want to blow up people. And those are my kind of dudes. And I think they actually say, should we call down fire on this dude? Look, if you can call down fire, why not just do it? Again, this is not a TikTok video or YouTube as to how to. This is, again, my own personal statement. So, but they're engaged in this conversation with Jesus, and Jesus says, no, look, if they're not against us, they're for us, right? Now, that's a tough concept to get your head around, because I kind of live in the stratus clouds, or the cirrus clouds that Brother Bruce is in, which is, yeah, I kind of know the best way to do it. I'm doing it the Bible way, and if I'm not doing it the Bible way, I'm doing it my way, which may be even better than the Bible way. Exactly. Plus, I might call some fire down. So if you combo meal all that, it's a good day. What Paul does is he goes and he trains and he sets up churches, and then he gets out of the way. And then here's the thing that makes sense to do. This is the thing that makes sense to do. And this is probably the commentary in some part, Guy, where you are, because I understand, even if I'm not always in complete agreement with what you just said, Diane, because you and I have experienced this together. You have to step in then when you see it going wrong. But you have to give it the freedom to go right, at least without you micromanaging. And so you can see Paul practicing this, because that's where most of his letters come in. With the exception of maybe to the Philippians, right? He was going, great job, big hearts, love you guys, pray for you guys, right? A lot of the other guys, he's going, good job, kind of, but you're doing this. And that's the kind of association that we have to have when we're allowing people to be participants as well as leaders in ministry elements. We have to be there to correct when it's not honoring the Lord. And so that's how we can then, in some ways, support alike the person who says they believe in Jesus, but they've got secret stuff going on, and then the person who would like to believe in Jesus, but they're doing all the things that are Bible-oriented, except they haven't made a profession of faith yet. Kind of make sense? All right, let me back off there, because that should be a little bit of worms, taking the top off it and opening it up. the bottom line on some of this conversation is there shouldn't be an exalted moment where folks walk to the front of the church and say, I am ready to be ordained for the next thing. When the Holy Spirit calls and transforms your heart so that it's no longer a heart of stone and a heart of flesh, you should be ready for service then. Should be ready for service then. And so it's almost like the thing that you've heard, I think Steve make reference to, and you've heard me sort of suggest over the years, is this. Put people to work right away. Put them to work right away. Because if you don't, when you come later and you say, oh, by the way, we were supposed to tell you were supposed to be doing this. And this was also a part of your Christian journey and your Christian, people are going to go, how come no one told me that before? That's not the way it works. And if that's not the way it works, I'm not really going to hang around here. I'm going to go someplace else. There should be an expectation that if folks say that they belong to Jesus, that there's evidence that they're at least doing something that is of service. Now, folks, the Jesus encounter question that we have, in many ways, is the very base or the very foundation of what it is that folks can be doing, if not building upon the information that they learn and they discover when they have those encounters. Because those exchanges may say that folks have to better become students of the Bible. Those encounters may say that folks need to develop a sense of nurturing and caring for someone in a way that they typically don't. Those encounters may say that they learn information about people that they need to pray about. And if not praying about, that they pray with and for the person. So that we're teaching folks that if they're professors and possessors of Jesus, that they need to be about our Father's business. And our Father's business that he mentioned that we would do greater things than him is about making disciples and teaching them to do all that he commanded. And the way that we're able to do that is when we're always of a service mindset. And the service mindset doesn't have to be the people who go to the front of the church who get the special bells and whistles, who we think that we're not fit to hold the hems of their garments, who we think are better than us, who we think are better prepared than us. And in many ways, some of those things are true. They're better prepared because they're getting paid, and we think because they're getting paid, they're the guys who should be doing. We're the folks who should be getting and receiving from the guys who are getting paid. And I would suggest to you that that is a topsy-turvy mindset that our churches have created. And in part, they've created because the folks who are in those paid positions don't want us taking their responsibilities away, because being less busy may mean less bucks or less position possibilities for me. Let alone me showing you what I do so that in some ways I'm unnecessary. Let me pause there.
I was just looking at the screen here and doing some math. I've got, let me see if I can express this. I have 3 rows of 4 people on my screen. Okay, my math says 3 times 4 is 12. Jesus empowering and leading a group this size exactly turned the world upside down. What's missing? To me, what you're saying is the piece is missing. We need to be, and I'm going to include myself there because I've already said at the very beginning, I need to do more. I think if we're more obedient, more focused, less busy about things that really don't matter in the eternal perspective, we could be a part of seeing the Lord turn 21st century world upside down. And that's just an observation I made sitting here looking at the screen of, and we use the Brady Bunch, we use, Landry, we use a lot of different expressions. We've got 12 people on right now. Yeah, the first century had a different sort of attitude toward female versus male, but I don't think that matters. I think that there's a great deal of capability right here to do great things for God. We just need to be willing to obey even when it doesn't make sense. And I think of Philip. Philip is in Samaria, number one, not a popular place. And he's seeing revival. He's seeing people coming to Christ. And contrary to what we would say now, he gets called away for one individual. Someone on the road in a chariot, works for Candace, and his ministry is to go to that one person. Again, he doesn't get called from something, he gets called to something. And then after the work there is done, which is very, very brief, he gets a Bible message and baptism, and all of a sudden he is miraculously, supernaturally, very Star Trek like transported to another location to do the next thing. What's missing with us? I think we're lacking the power. I think we're lacking the power because we're lacking the obedience. Again, I put myself in that. If I remember something Pam said, most of you know Pam. She realizes somehow that she's been impressed to put a screwdriver in her purse. Now, for a lady to do that sounds pretty odd, but she does it. And sure enough, when she does it, she realizes down the road in her day that there was a reason she was impressed to do that. Somebody needed that, it helped somebody. We need to be more obedient to the things that make less sense to us, because down the road, God's got a plan for that. God's got a use for that. God's got something he's going to do far beyond what we can imagine. I made a discovery. I think it was this past week. My laptop I'm using right now for work, and they gave me permission to use for this. The battery was going bad. So I put in a ticket to get the IT people to do something about that. And we finally got a schedule arranged, and I needed to go and take it to the IT people so they could change the battery out. And so I would actually be able to hold a charge and be able to use it off the wire. In the process of doing that, I stopped by my old department, the finance department. I'm not with them anymore. I'm actually with financial planning and analysis out of Davenport. So, but I go there, and somebody has moved into my old cubicle. How many of you remember Jeremy Zorns? Guess who's moved into my old cubicle? His wife. His wife. Her name is Leanne Zorns. And I did a little bit of looking up. There's a connection there. All that to say, had I done things differently, maybe I would have been better prepared to learn that. To be obedient is to bring down the power. Preston talks about calling down the fire. We can't. You know why we can't? Because we don't have the power. You know why we don't have the power? We're not obedient. Myself included. That's enough of that sermon.
I've been reading this week about Tony Dungy, and he speaks a great deal about the power of mentorship throughout his life, even when he was a young man. People took interest in him and met with him specifically. I think sometimes wouldn't that be a beautiful thing if we could mentor either someone new in the church or someone who's going to a position like Bruce says, it's time for you to move out. Take someone under our wing. Why don't we do that more? It doesn't even have to take a whole lot of time. You talked about the last one. They went through Nehemiah and would meet once every 2 to 3 weeks to talk about it. It wouldn't be a lot of time, but think about the growth and the maturity that you could get to so much faster if you had that mentor you could call at the drop of a hat.
Well, that mentor relationship, that's all Bible. So it's not new, but it sounds new when you present it that way, Diane, because we don't do that in our churches. I know what I know, and I've achieved what I've achieved, and who are you to tell me? And so sometimes that limits our ability to grow and to change because we're a little bit unwilling, which goes back to Gene's comment, which was we're not obedient, and that's why this Luke 6:46 is very, very key, and I think ties in very, very strongly with Paul's pronouncement is that when I'm weak, then Jesus has the most ability to be illumined through me. And I recognize where our time is right now, so I want to maybe throw this out for you because see, our Jesus encounters, those questions are meant to help get us where Gene says that we need to be, which is more obedient. Folks, it's one thing to read Ed and Anita's and Bob and Judy's statements and then go, hey, that's great, because we support them. But it's another to be influenced and impacted by them in such a way where you go, we can't leave them alone to be doing this work. And I'm reminded of something that my wife every now and then will remind me about. I don't know if a lot of you listen to radio or podcast sermons, because you've heard me over the years, and I'm not a big Christian music listener too, because I just don't like Christian music. But I listen to a lot of sermons, and there's certainly folks that are folks that I admire a great deal. One of those is a deceased pastor who I think is one of the most brilliant modern day theologians, and his name is R.C. Sproul. And my wife would hear me listening to him, especially because sometimes he would follow or would be followed by Alistair Begg, who, if you know him as a pastor, he's wonderfully upbeat. He's Scottish. He's got a neat accent. He's one of those guys that he could say anything, and you go, could you just say, I don't even know if I believe that, but could you just say it again? Because you just say it so wonderfully. And so she'd listen to me listening to R.C. Sproul, and she would turn off after a while. She goes, that guy is so boring. And I would, and so one day she said, why are you listening to that guy? I said, honey, I said, what this guy does is he shows you, even especially from an academic sense, that all roads lead to Jesus. Everything he talks about and teaches about, even in an academic sense, he can talk creationism, he can talk evolution, he can talk etymology of words, he can talk about history, and he can show you how everything leads to Jesus. And that, in exchange with my wife, changed her appreciation of this guy, but also her thinking about when we have interpersonal encounters with people. And so when she's opening up our session today, talking about her Jesus encounter, that's a regular kind of thing for us that we've begun to practice. And the funny thing about it, what's even better is we actually can tag team doing this. And so there are circumstances where I, as a guy, can only maybe go so far, but my wife can step in differently because, especially if it's a lady or if it's a situation that she understands better, well, then she can go the rest of the way. And so when I'm watching my wife pray at a bar with a lady, I'm jumping up and down going, yes, 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 that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what we should get excited about, folks, because it's really nice to have horses and chariots and the stuff that accompanies horses and chariots. But at the end of our being in this particular lifetime, none of that matters. And so doing that which matters is what should be exciting us, is what we should be focused on. And so let me throw out one more crazy challenge as we kind of begin to close here. I know that, for instance, Sarah had a Jesus encounter a couple of weeks back where she is on the precipice of looking to encounter a friend to talk with her about Jesus in the wake of her friend having a deceased family member. And one of the exchanges that Ellen and I had this week, as we were laughing about our several Jesus encounters, whether they're here at home or whether they're in the community, et cetera, was this. If you think back to Sarah's kitty litter, and again, for you folks watching for the first time, I don't mean that Sarah uses kitty litter herself. I mean that she uses it for that which would use kitty litter. So again, not TikTok or YouTube. Do as I say. I'd like to impress upon you maybe this condition. As fruitful as Diane's interaction was with her daughter this week, you may be more emboldened to have a Jesus encounter with a perfect stranger. In fact, I would suggest to you it's a better training opportunity, because ultimately you may never see that person again. So you don't have to think, did I do it right? Did I do it well? Do they hate me? Did they write me off? Have they canceled me? Am I unfriended? You can just put it out there, kind of the way that Bruce was saying. Just try it. Because I remember my wife, when she prayed with us later this week, she came back and she said, I was a little nervous. I don't know if I really nailed that the right way. And I said, honey, you had to have nailed it, because the lady didn't go kicking and screaming. She didn't vomit. It looks like it was a success. And so sometimes these opportunities, these encounters may work better with a perfect stranger than with a person that you might know, because of your nerves, your familiarity, your anxiety. But with a person that you don't know, well, there's certainly those kind of things, but then you don't have to worry about the aftermath, because you may never see them again. They're a perfect laboratory opportunity. And so you will hear me speak less and less about this, because it's kind of become the practice in our family. Let's figure out how many of these we can have, not as a competition, but all roads, all opportunities should be chock full of this week. So it's fun that, even when we're a little yucky with each other, we get excited about this having happened this week. It's the thing that matters. It's the thing that's going to matter when all of the horses and chariots get discounted. So let me pause, let you comment there, and it's 11:11. All right. Thank you for joining this morning. You're already blessed, right? So go act on it and go let other people know that you are. That's how the club gets bigger. And please be aware that we're putting neat strategies in place to help all of us to become those front of the church ordained folks without the lights and the bells and whistles and he's a jolly good fellow. That's where we're headed. And just like Gene said, folks, there's 12 of us. Whoop-de-doo. Jesus took 12 and made it millions.